Hi all. This is just a quick video I'm going to put together. Hopefully quick. Hopefully it won't be 30 hours long. Just talking about the best we could do, the graphic novel reading for the class. I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of pull some things together right now as you're getting into writing your third paper, where you're engaging directly with that text. You've been doing great work with perusal, engaging with that. And remember, this is week 13. I'm shooting this on Tuesday evening. My kids are in bed, so I'm shooting you a video. Uh, you know, Remember, there's a couple more chapters to go through this week to finish up that book, and then your rough draft to get in by Thursday. So let's just go through some of that stuff. Let me pull up there they are, the instructions for essay number 3, right? I'm sure, well, I hope everybody's looked through these. Uh, what you need to do, first of all, is think about your prompt, right? And I've looked through a couple of the proposals so far. I'm going to get to those next couple days, give you some feedback you can use while you're working on your draft of this paper. But of course, this is the first um, task for you to do, is think about which of these interests you the most. And I've gone through these. I think I put together another video for this, so we'll go through them in depth. But that's your first idea, because this will give you hints for what you're looking for as you go through the book, right? So if you choose number 3, pardon me, thinking about this idea of refugee reflex, pardon me, you're going to want to go to 305, where I've given you the page number, and work backwards or work out from there, right? Because this is going to be your central page there. However, if you're, thinking about geography and surroundings, you're going to want to look at different chapters, and I might give you some clues as we go through. If you want to think about the context of the story, Vietnam War, that kind of stuff, there's a couple really good chapters to look at. I'll talk about that in a minute. Uh, what less is about immigration and refugees. This is kind of like the broader prompt, right? So hopefully this one is, if you're working on something in essay number 2 that you really want to kind of like apply to what you're talking about here. Say you're talking about that grande essay for essay number 2, you know, the one who's left behind, or the parent who stays. I think it's called the parent who stays. Pardon me. And the toll that being a refugee and immigration has on families. You could definitely take that same theme and work on it with the best we could do, right? Because their family's not the same after they escape to America from this war-torn place that they're Vietnam that they're escaping from, right? Supposedly to a better place, but it kind of ruins their family at the same time. Much like what happens to the Grande family in that Grande essay, The Parent Who Stays. So you could, build on that. And there's some places to look for that, if you want to build on a theme like that. And then this last one, this is more for, I don't know, maybe fans of poetry and writing. There's a poem, This Be the Verse. Um, and it's a really dark take, or a much darker take on what happens with families, right? I think that Tai Bui's graphic novel ends on a much more optimistic note. So let's take a look at the book. Where did I have this? So I went to the library site, and if you just type in the best we could do, let me go back to the main page and just walk you through this, right? The library is set up only to find ebooks right now, since we're not really open to give out books, right? So I typed in the best we could do, search. The first result comes up with our book. This might be an easier way to read the book, rather than going through the perusal that I've loaded, where I loaded the chapters onto perusal. This is you can get the book in one place without, it shouldn't take as long to load. You won't have to worry about the comments, so it shouldn't take as long. So let's take a look at the book, just structure wise, right? Because you guys have been really digging into every chapter of the book, and it's been, I like the conversations that are happening. That the issue there, of course, is that you're looking very narrow at like very specific things. So sometimes it's easy to lose track of the overall picture. And it's I think it's a good time for us now to kind of step back and think about what she's doing in this whole book, right? So we have 10 chapters. Each one has a kind of poetic title, right? That gives us a clue to what she's going to be looking at in that book, right? They're all very relevant to the topic, right? Her first chapter, labor. I mean, of course, she has that preface, which is interesting. She has that conversation with Viet Thanh Nguyen, the guy who edited that other collection of essays, The Displaced, that we were looking at. We read one of his essays as well. he also wrote. You can see it's on the cover of the book, the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Sympathizer, which is a great book. I've read it. I would strongly recommend it if you're interested in this topic. If it's refugees and the Vietnam War and things like this, it's really interesting. Um, Really beautifully written too. Anyway, so there is that. But then when we jump into the actual chapters, right, we start with chapter one, labor. And it's called labor. This is an interesting title for the chapter. I hope you give it some thought because, of course, she's in labor. She's giving birth to a child. But it's also, I think she means it in a double meaning, right? There's a labor going on. She's about to undertake this task of looking backwards into her past and unraveling some of this baggage and this pain that she's had to deal with and that her parents kind of brought with them because of this journey they had to go on. This fleeing from their country. The pain that they brought with them, as we see with her father, especially her father, right, who has a hard time adjusting to this different life, right, and is not perhaps a very good father in some ways, right. So she's going through this labor, not only physically trying to have a child, but also this she's about to undergo this emotional and mental labor, right? And that's the memoir itself. Like she's looking backwards into her past and her family's past to unravel these mysteries and try to make some peace with her past, right? So I think it's an interesting title because she's setting up this idea of the hard work of looking backwards, rewind, reverse. So she's starting to look backwards. We kind of get, she's starting. She gives us like a survey of her family, some of the dynamics going on there, but it's all much more like, she's starting to look backwards, but it's more present day. Home, the holding pen, she's looking at her childhood, so she's moving backwards. Blood and Rice, she's getting into her father's history, right? This is where she goes and tells, the story of her father's childhood and so on. Either or, she switches to her mother, right? She's telling her mother's childhood and upbringing, what brought her, made her who she is. The chessboard, this is, the two parents are coming together. And at the same time, this is an interesting title for the chapter too, because, if you're into chess, it's a strategy game. It's often used as a kind of military metaphor, right? This metaphor for military movements, pawns on the chessboard and that kind of stuff. So, her parents are very much pawns in this larger conflict that's happening in Vietnam. They don't really have an active role in the war. They're not actively involved, right? They're kind of middle class intellectuals, more or less, just trying to live their lives, right? And they get caught up in this war for which they don't really have any, they're not that involved anyways. So, they're involved in these larger movements that are happening in their lives are moved around because of this. And at the same time, we see this, them coming together as a couple, starting a family, that kind of stuff. Heroes and Losers, this is very much, about that climatic end of the Vietnam War, the fall of Saigon, and her family fleeing Vietnam, becoming what was known as the boat people. You might have heard that term. You might not have. It was a term that people used to describe the people who were fleeing from Vietnam in particular, because they were fleeing on boats, of course. That's why, boat people. Vietnam is, surrounded by a lot of water. They were fleeing the only way they could on these uh, largely dangerous boats. A lot of people died in the journey trying to flee Vietnam at the time. It's kind of reminiscent of what's happening in Northern Africa, right? You have people who are trying to flee from different places in Northern Africa to get to Europe, and we have that famous picture of the dead boy on was it Greece? I think on the beach in Greece. I can't remember, but it's the famous picture that went around a few years ago, and lots of deaths as people try to flee. It's the same kind of movement of people, the only way they can with these boats. And the communists who won the war, the Vietnamese War, were not happy about people trying to flee, right? So this was an underground thing. Anyways, Heroes and Losers gets into that, right? The fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War, uh, and it gets into all that stuff. The Shore tells a story of the family as they, land on a shore, and eventually make their way to America, right? As refugees, going through refugee camps, going through all the bureaucracy and the paperwork. And there's a great section in this book where she uses literal photos of her family, which is an interesting thing you might want to deal with in your paper, really use as an example in your paper. Perhaps if you're going to look at, that first prompt, asking about context, asking about, the how does the what's happening in the world at the time affect the story and affect what she's trying to say. Here is, photographic proof that her family went through this pretty harrowing experience. They're pretty, uh, exactly what you would expect from a refugee camp picture. So that might be something to think about, why she includes those literal pictures. Fire and Ash. So we're back. She picks up the story again. And here's the interesting thing, right? She starts in the present day, labor, moves a bit backwards to her father and mother. Then she comes back, right? So around the middle of the book, exactly in the middle of the book, I guess, she starts moving back forwards, right? The chessboard and onwards, right? Her parents are getting together, fall to Saigon, they have to flee, they flee. They're in America, trying to make their way in America. And she gets into some more of, this is the section with that part about the refugee reflex, right? That kind of refugee reflex part, and that's why I made it one of the prompts too. It's kind of like a climax of the book in a way, because after that she returns to present day, where she's kind of dealing with her thoughts about her family and trying to make peace with it, so she can move on and become a mother herself, right? So it's an interesting structure here, right? She starts in the present day, um, and then kind of throws us in the past. And it's, especially in Home, the Holding Pen, when you're reading about her and her father, Bo, that relationship, and just, how traumatized Bo is, and how he kind of like takes it out on his family in a way, and is a very hard man to live with, right? And she has this, these certain things about her childhood that are kind of hard to understand at first, but then when you go through and you see all the things they've gone through, you get to that part where she's talking about the refugee reflex, and I think it makes a lot more sense, right? And that's why it's kind of the climax of the book in a certain way. That section on page 305, when she's talking about the refugee reflex. So that'd be something, even if you're not working on that prompt, that would be definitely something to pay a lot of attention to this week. We're doing chapters 8, 9, and 10 this week. So chapter 9 and that section would be something really to pay close attention to. Something else to think about, maybe I'll open up Ebb and Flow. This is the last chapter. Let me see if I can quickly scan to a good image. Here's one where you get like, here's T-Boy in the present day thinking, and here's your memories in the past. So we get a lot of these kind of images where it's like the memories are superimposed in the background, which is something to pay attention to. It's like the memories are haunting the present day, right? That's a lot of the ways that some of these images work. But also notice the water imagery, right? They're in this boat. This is in her background. There's a lot of water imagery in this book. This is something to really pay attention to, regardless of what you're working on, to think about this idea. The last chapter 2, Ebb and Flow, could be talking about, the ebb and flow of water, of waves, that kind of thing, the tide, right? But here we get towards the end, and no spoilers, of course, but I'm trying to get to these. Right, it's more of this water imagery, which is what I wanted to think about with this book. It seems to be a real visual theme throughout the book, right? And this is, her son now, right, who's enjoying the water. There's some great scenes earlier in the Either Or chapter, especially, and some of the other chapters where the people are enjoying going to the beach, and that's part of their childhood. A lot of us have that experience, right? She's trying to make peace with this idea of becoming a mother because she felt so hampered by her parents, right? So it's just something to think about as you're going through this water imagery, especially if you're to think about number 2, if you're looking at geography and surroundings. The water imagery might be something to think about because it just seems to play such a graphic role in the novel, right? And it might tie in, you might make a case that it ties in with this idea of Vietnamese refugees being called boat people back in the day. Anyways, that's it for now. Thank you very much. Bye bye.